Malicious Compliance number 3. I got punished for being too good at my job, so before I quit, I decided to do exactly what they were paying me to do, and absolutely nothing more. I worked remotely for an auto parts company for almost 4 years. Eventually, after our company merged with another one, I finally got promoted. But despite the fact that I was outperforming pretty much everyone else in my department, I ended up getting punished for it, literally for being too good at my job. I originally joined a company that had been founded in my area but was known all over the world. They specialized in parts for classic cars. Naturally, we had the usual problems with suppliers, shipping delays, back orders, all that stuff. But the company had an excellent reputation. We were considered one of the biggest sources for hard-to-find automotive parts. Everything from Ford Model Ts and Model As to modern muscle cars, and pretty much anything in between. Then some genius in management decided we needed brand new software to handle sales, inventory, parts, and service. And that's when everything started falling apart. One program would say we had 10 of a certain part sitting in the warehouse, while the inventory system said we had none. The accounting software would say we owed a supplier money, while another system insisted we didn't owe them anything. Nobody really knew what the hell was going on. And eventually, the manager responsible for bringing in this disaster left the company with a nice, fat severance package. Meanwhile, we started losing customers, then suppliers, then orders. Basically, we were losing everything. And since I was a manager handling customer inquiries, I spent every day answering phone calls and trying to feed angry customers whatever official explanation the company wanted us to give them. Whatever management told me to say, I'd say it, just to try to calm people down. As you can probably imagine, employee turnover became insane, and the company came dangerously close to going bankrupt. And that's when Big Auto Parts entered the picture. Obviously, that's not their real name, so let's just call them BAP. BAP came in promising they were going to fix everything. And to be fair, they mostly did. They paid off debts to suppliers, cleared up outstanding accounts, and started rebuilding all the relationships the previous management had destroyed. They also fired about 60% of the office employees in my city. Was it sad? Yeah. But unfortunately, that's business. About 6 months after the merger, I was promoted to Customer Operations Specialist. That meant I wasn't taking incoming calls anymore. Instead, I was the one calling customers for all kinds of different reasons. When I first moved into the position, there was already another employee in the department. I'll call her Lucy. We handled different parts of the same process. I would figure out what the actual problem was, and Lucy would contact the customer and offer them a solution. Here's a simple example. Let's say a part someone ordered was out of stock or delayed. I'd find a comparable replacement, or I'd contact the supplier and get an estimated arrival date. Then I'd pass everything over to Lucy. She would call the customer and ask whether they wanted to wait for the original part or switch to the alternative. Pretty straightforward. Well, it took Lucy about 3 weeks to realize the job wasn't for her, so she quit, and that left a massive hole that somebody had to fill. Since I already had plenty of experience talking to customers on the phone, they asked me to temporarily handle both jobs. And strangely enough, it worked even better than anyone expected. Because I was already familiar with every situation, I didn't need information passed back and forth between two people. I could investigate the problem, call the customer myself, and come up with better solutions while I was actually talking to them. My manager noticed how well it was working and put me in for a small raise. And I actually got it. So now I was making pretty decent money doing something I genuinely enjoyed. The company started growing, and naturally, the workload grew right along with it. For everybody. We had a ticketing system. It wasn't perfect, but for the most part, it worked. Every once in a while, though, something would break and I'd suddenly get hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of completely unnecessary tickets dumped into my queue. Eventually, I started noticing patterns behind these glitches. Whenever I did, I'd report them to my manager so somebody who made more money than I did could figure out what was causing the problem and fix it at the source. Then everybody could finish their work, go home, and be happy. As the company continued growing, certain areas of our department started receiving more tickets than one person could realistically handle. So management asked me to cross-train and learn several additional parts of the department. It didn't take me very long, and before I knew it, I was doing other people's jobs better than the people who were actually assigned to them. I think there were 2 reasons for that. I wanted to work hard. They wanted to do the bare minimum. Remember that part, because it's going to become very important later. We had a point system that tracked our performance. It measured how many tickets we handled, how much time we spent on them, and how each ticket was resolved. Did somebody need to follow up later? Or could the ticket immediately be closed as resolved? For one reason or another, most of my tickets could usually be closed right away. And because of that, I almost always hit the numbers required to earn our weekly performance bonus. That bonus was an extra $2.50 an hour. With it, my hourly rate was above $20 almost every single week, with only a few exceptions. So naturally, I was happy. I thought I was doing exactly what the company wanted me to do. To qualify for the bonus, I needed at least 200 customer calls and 2,400 points every week. I was doing between 300 and 500 calls, and I was averaging close to 7,000 points every single week. For a little background, when I was younger, I earned a degree from a local college in video production. That had always been my real passion, but things were going well at my current job, and I genuinely enjoyed working there. Twice a year, once in the spring and once in the winter, I'd travel up north to the company's main office. I made a lot of friends there. Even the owners of the company knew me by name because I worked hard and consistently put up great numbers. Then my wife changed jobs and started working for our local sheriff's office. One day she emailed me and said they had an opening in their media department. That immediately caught my attention, so I applied, and I went through the entire 3-month hiring process. I even warned my current employer ahead of time that someone from the sheriff's office might contact them as part of my background check. Everything was going smoothly. It got to the point where the sheriff himself personally called me and told me how excited he was that I'd applied. But let's go back to my current company. By this point, management had already spoken to me several times about my performance numbers. My manager told me my numbers were too high. Yeah, too high. Apparently nobody else was even coming close to the number of points I was earning. I told him I was simply following the metrics the company had created and doing my job. He told me there were going to be some changes soon. And then came the perfect coincidence. The exact same day the sheriff's office called and told me I'd gotten the new job, I had a meeting scheduled with my manager. I hadn't even had a chance to tell him I was leaving yet when he dropped the news on me. The company was introducing a brand new point system. He explained that if my numbers from that week were recalculated using the new system, my 7,000 points would become 1,800, 7,000 down to 1,800. That would put me well below the minimum required to earn the weekly bonus. I looked at him and said, "So basically, I'm being punished for being good at my job." And his response was basically, "Well, this is what the company has decided to do." Like I said earlier, that bonus was what pushed my hourly rate above $20. And my new job was offering me more money right from the start than I was making here even with the bonus. So suddenly, the decision became incredibly easy. Right then and there, I gave him my 2 weeks notice. But what really sealed the deal for me was something else I found out afterward. Even though I was required to work my full 40-hour week and finish on Friday, the company's payroll week technically ended on Saturday. And because I wouldn't technically be employed on Saturday, they weren't planning to credit me for the paid time off I'd accumulated. So after nearly 4 years of working my ass off for this company, they were going to keep my earned sick time and vacation hours because of a technicality. That was the moment I was completely done. Now, I actually liked my direct manager. He was younger than my already married son. He had a disability, and honestly, he was a genuinely good guy with a kind heart. He wasn't happy about any of this either. He hated the fact that company policy was basically forcing him to punish someone for performing too well. So I told him exactly how I felt about the whole situation, and then I told him something else. For my final 2 weeks, I would perform only the duties listed in my original job description, not one task more. And it was glorious. Our company allowed us to use accumulated vacation or sick time to leave early, as long as all of our assigned work for the day was finished, and there was nothing else we were required to do. So that's exactly what I did. I focused exclusively on the areas that were actually part of my original job. Once everything in my queue was finished, I'd clock out and use my accumulated paid time to cover the rest of the day. By my final day, I'd managed to use every single hour I had accumulated. And because I wasn't helping anyone else anymore, their work started piling up, fast. Now, I wasn't trying to screw over any of the friends I'd made at the company. I genuinely liked a lot of those people. I was simply trying to make a point. I still had access to all the ticket queues I'd previously worked in, so I could see exactly what was happening. And I watched those numbers start spiraling out of control. My manager's boss messaged me more than once, asking if I could jump in and help. And every time I'd politely explain that I didn't think it would be fair for me to take points away from the other employees, especially since I was leaving soon anyway. And according to company policy, I'd already completed all of my assigned responsibilities, which meant I was free to end my workday. He'd hesitate, then he'd try to convince me to do what was best for the company, and I'd simply tell him, "I'm doing what's best for me. If you can't offer me more than the sheriff's office is willing to pay me, then until my final day, I'm only going to do the work you're actually paying me to do." On my final day, right before logging out for the last time, I checked the ticket queues one final time. My section, 0, completely empty. But the other areas I'd previously been helping with, the ones that normally had maybe 10 open or unprocessed tickets at the end of the day, hundreds, and I logged out, for good. But the most satisfying part came about 6 months later. A former coworker I genuinely liked messaged me on Facebook to wish me a Merry Christmas. And during our conversation, he told me something that made the whole situation even better. They still hadn't found anyone who could handle the amount of work I'd been doing. Not one person. As for me, I'm happy at my new job, and if everything continues going well, I plan to stay here for as long as they'll have me. Then hopefully after many years of service, I'll finally retire in peace. You want me to give you a valid reason every time I take PTO? All right then, prepare yourself for an unnecessary amount of deeply uncomfortable personal information. I work at a pretty normal job, which makes it even funnier that my boss insists that whenever we use our paid time off, we have to provide a valid reason. Like, dude, why exactly do I need to explain to you why I want to use my vacation days? They're mine. I earned them. I should be allowed to take a day off because I've discovered an exciting new hobby called lying in bed and staring at the ceiling. It's none of your business. Anyway, I was planning to take a couple of days off just to decompress after a fairly stressful week at work. Nothing dramatic. I just needed a break. Unfortunately for my boss, that happened to be the exact moment he decided to send everyone a reminder email. If we wanted to use our vacation days, we needed to provide a reason and get it approved. That was his mistake. So I walked into his office with my head down and started telling him about my father's cancer, about the brutal chemotherapy, about how difficult it was for the whole family. I wasn't exactly forcing myself to cry, but let's just say those acting classes I took in college finally paid off. At one point, I'm pretty sure I even said something like, "It's just, I've always seen my dad as this strong, indestructible person, and now he's just human, you know? And one day soon, he might not be here anymore. How am I supposed to deal with that?" My boss looked incredibly uncomfortable, which was perfect. Because here's the thing, my dad had beaten cancer years earlier. He was fine. The entire emotional performance was complete theater. But hey, my boss wanted a valid reason, so I gave him one. I'd love to tell you that after this, he immediately sent out another email saying we no longer had to explain why we were taking PTO. Unfortunately, we weren't that lucky. So instead, I just kept inventing increasingly tragic events in my personal life whenever I needed time off. Apparently, my grandmother has died about 3 times over the past few years. Poor woman. At this point, I'm probably going to have to come up with something completely different when she actually dies. And to this day, my boss still visibly tenses up whenever I walk into his office to request time off in person instead of just submitting it by email. And honestly, I find that absolutely hilarious. Unauthorized software? No problem, I'll remove it right now. I work as a contractor for the United States Air Force. One day, a security audit discovered that Python was installed on my work laptop. I was informed that Python wasn't authorized for local use at our site. That was news to me. I had documentation showing that Python was approved for use on the corporate network as a whole. I also knew of at least 3 other sites where people were using it without any issues. Before this incident, nobody had ever told me that Python was specifically prohibited at our location, and the local approved software list, which was basically an ancient Excel spreadsheet, wasn't shown to me until after all of this happened. Fortunately, everything was being handled through the official ticketing system, so I didn't even have to ask them to put the order in writing. It was already there. I simply replied that I understood the instructions and would immediately remove Python from every system I worked with, as requested. And just to be clear, that was exactly what I had been told to do. The instruction came from a specific person, and it was very straightforward. Remove Python from every device you use. No alternatives were offered. According to this person, Python was prohibited everywhere at our site. Alright, if that's what you want. About 30 minutes later, our site suddenly lost a whole bunch of advanced features from the VoIP system. The call trees stopped working, conference call numbers stopped working, emergency callouts stopped working, several operator functions disappeared, call recording stopped working, announcements stopped working. Basically, a whole bunch of useful phone system features suddenly vanished. Why? Because I'd removed Python from the servers I managed, exactly as instructed. Those servers were using a Python package called PIS together with Asterisk. Asterisk was part of the VoIP service we used for all kinds of customized tasks. It allowed us to do some pretty useful and sophisticated things with call routing and telephone automation. Or at least, it used to, because suddenly none of those things worked anymore. I reported exactly why the outage was happening, and almost immediately I was told to urgently reinstall Python everywhere it had previously been installed. Apparently, they had decided to make an exception for us. Funny how quickly that rule changed. The outage didn't last very long, so thankfully it wasn't a major disaster. But I have to admit, it was pretty funny. The moral of the story? Don't tell a system administrator to uninstall something until you've asked what it's actually being used for. And yes, I know, I probably should have pushed back before removing it. But the person who gave the order was one of those people who liked throwing their authority around and really didn't appreciate being questioned. Arguing with them and trying to convince them to do things properly would have probably cost me just as much stress as simply following the order. and then fixing everything afterward. My management wasn't angry with me once they saw the ticket. After all, the instructions were right there in writing. And one last detail. The reason Python was installed on my workstation in the first place, I used it to write and debug code for those exact same servers. The HOA board president wanted the heat turned on. All right, you want heat? You're getting heat. I manage a condominium building in New York City. Our building has a central heating and air conditioning system. The problem is, once we switch the system over to winter mode, there's no switching it back to cooling until spring. And under New York City rules, heating season begins on October 1st. But anyone who's spent an October in New York knows how unpredictable the weather can be. One day it's freezing. A couple of days later, it feels like summer again. So for years, we had a simple arrangement. We'd wait until the weather became consistently cold, and then we'd switch the building over to heat. The residents were perfectly fine with this. That's how we'd handled it for years. Because most people would rather be a little chilly for one day than spend the next 10 days sweating inside an apartment with no air conditioning. Everyone understood that. Well, almost everyone. Last year, sometime around the middle of October, we had one slightly chilly day, and apparently that was enough for the president of our HOA board. She sent me an email demanding that I turn the heat on immediately, but she didn't stop there. She also made it very clear that from that point forward, the building's heat was to be turned on every year on October 1st, no exceptions. She didn't care if the weather warmed back up. She didn't care if everyone else in the building ended up roasting in their apartments. She was the president of the HOA board, and apparently, what mattered most was that she was comfortable in her own apartment. All right then, message received. So this year, we did exactly what she told us to do. October 1st arrived, and we turned on the heat, exactly as ordered. Not surprisingly, the weather warmed up again. And by the time we had our annual residents meeting, people were furious. Everyone wanted to know why a system that had worked perfectly well for years had suddenly changed. Why had we turned the heat on so early? Why were their apartments unbearably hot? And that's when the HOA president immediately started blaming me. She began lecturing me in front of everyone as if this entire situation had somehow been my decision. Apparently, she'd completely forgotten about the email she'd sent me the year before. Fortunately, I hadn't, and I really wasn't interested in participating in this little performance. So, after getting permission from my boss, I connected my computer to the projector, and I put her email up on the screen for everyone to see. Her words, her instructions, her demand that the heat be turned on every single year on October 1st, exactly what we'd done. She went pale, and for what may have been the first time in her life, she had absolutely nothing to say. At the next board election, she lost her position. Her replacement was very happy that we'd finally exposed what had actually happened. And as for our company, our management contract with the building was renewed for another 5 years. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode. If you have any thoughts about what happened, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.